Survivor's Trauma Toolbox. Trauma is responsible for a slew of mental malfunctions. What can you do about it? If you tuned into our last episode, this is going to sound familiar.
I rounded the carport and flung open the door. I slammed it shut as the power went out. I heard things slam in my house. Then the sheetrock overhead fell down, and it sounded like my roof lifted and came back down. I heard the sound of nails being pulled out of wood, glass breaking, and then the scariest sound I've ever heard. I prayed that I'd never hear again. It was a groan, a moaning, and I can only describe it as evil. It caused me to shake head to toe.
For those of you who missed our last episode, this is Adam, and he just survived the heart of a tornado. But even though the storm had passed and he had survived without critical injury, that storm had planted something in Adam's brain. His shaking, his nightmares, they would go on for months. You may have experienced something like this. If you've been through a traumatic event and still feel the fear and anxiety, you might just have post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. I'm PJ Aubrey, one of your hosts at A Survivor's Guide to Hell. Here, we believe there is no better way to save our world from chaos, corruption, and decline than by healing our minds. Each episode, we'll share mental health tools using incredible true stories and science-backed advice. Together, we can help heal the world one brain at a time. In today's episode, our healing will be focused on one of the most daunting topics in mental health: trauma and PTSD. Adam was experiencing symptoms of PTSD. Not everyone who experiences trauma develops PTSD. Depending on the person, one may only feel the symptoms of trauma for a few hours, a few days, maybe a few weeks. But some of us, like Adam, will have that alarm going off in our brains for a long time. So long, in fact, that our amygdala actually gets measurably larger, more powerful, and harder to escape. Do you remember the amygdala? It was the brain's alarm system, and the bigger it gets, the harder it is to get away from those sirens. I use the word sirens because that's how the amygdala can make you feel inside. Like some instinct, some feeling is telling you that things are not all right. Almost like an actual emergency siren. It raises your anxiety, you feel more tense, and it can really threaten your quality of life. Sure, we may get used to the siren, it might sound quieter, but it's there. And it prompts us to act emotionally and unpredictably. In fact, that's often how trauma spreads, like the flu. A traumatized individual may act so emotionally and so unpredictably that the people around them lose their sense of safety. The people around them may be abused by them as they act out in fear and rage. The trauma cycle keeps spinning unless we find out how to break it. Just as there are numberless ways to experience trauma, there are numberless ways to heal from trauma. Some people might require little or no work to feel back to their old selves. Others might need years of deliberate effort just to get back to normal. Either way, everyone has a chance. Psychologists and biologists now acknowledge that the brain is always changing, always growing, and always adapting, even if you think you're too old and embittered to recover. This Survivor's Toolbox is dedicated to exploring some of the most promising treatments for trauma victims and pointing you towards the resources that could help you heal. If you don't struggle, but you know someone who does, this information could help you become the support that they need. Let's friggin' do this! Method 1 for overcoming trauma and PTSD. CPT therapy. For lovers of the tried, true, and therapy-based. A little disclaimer, everyone. This segment shares the details of a young woman's experience with sexual violence. 13-year-old Jamie was walking down the sunny streets of her middle-class LA neighborhood. It was the 90s, and Jamie described the place as a, quote, tree-lined, sun-kissed America dream neighborhood. On her stroll, she passed an alley between an apartment building and an office building, and, quote, that guy was there. She'd seen him around, but Jamie didn't know the man. Occasionally, when they crossed paths, she'd offer a simple, hi. But today was different. Today, with a friendly face, he beckoned her into the alley. Here, this mystery man held a knife to her side. He said her father owed him money, which she knew was impossible, and the man began groping under her boxers. He felt her, forced her to let him kiss her private areas. She tried to scream, but what came out was small and quiet. All the same, it sent the man running down the alley, then out of sight. Jamie was traumatized. As she grew, she battled with feelings of guilt. She felt she should have known better. She shouldn't ever have said hi when she saw him. She shouldn't have been so stupid as to approach him in the alley. Almost any outsider would give her the benefit of the doubt. After all, the world is nuanced and unpredictable, and she was only trying to be friendly and respectful. But Jamie didn't see it that way. Jamie Lowe would grow up to write and report for one of the world's most popular radio shows, This American Life. There, she produced a very special episode. For all her listeners to hear, Jamie confronted her trauma with cognitive processing therapy, CPT for short. CPT is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that targets trauma. It challenges its participants to discover the root of their unhealthy thoughts and behaviors, then helps them modify those thoughts and behaviors. Some professionals don't want to admit this, but many forms of therapy just don't have the statistics to justify their cost. But CPT does. In 10 sessions, for Jamie, just 2 weeks of therapy, she was able to overcome a massive portion of the trauma symptoms she'd carried for nearly 30 years. If you're interested in hearing her episode on CPT therapy, you'll find a link in the show notes. One analysis scrutinized 1,130 participants between 11 different studies and found that CPT improved PTSD symptoms in 89% of cases. In fact, CPT and its parent therapy, CBT, may have the most impressive numbers compared to other traditional therapy approaches. One of the major benefits of cognitive processing therapy is that each person goes through the same steps to achieve healing. This means the therapy doesn't have to be administered by an actual therapist, though many people find the therapist part very helpful. Because the steps remain the same for everyone, you can purchase a CPT book online and walk yourself through the entire process. This makes CPT incredibly promising for anyone who may not have the means or the time or the trust to pay for an in-person therapy session. CPT is one of the most tried and true methods for addressing trauma, and we love the looks of it at A Survivor's Guide to Hell. But there are other, bolder strategies that could give you a boost in unexpected ways. Method 2. Psychedelic medicine. For nature lovers and science lovers alike. You're hearing one of the saddest parts of research. A poor group of mice experiencing a series of electric shocks in the name of science. This is a dramatization, of course. In the actual experiment, each of these beeps is actually accompanied by an electric shock, zapping the mouse and quickly training it not just to fear the zap, but the beep that it comes with. In other words, these mice were intentionally given PTSD. But, lucky for them, it's not the only thing they were given. Researchers injected the mice with psilocybin, the same chemical that gives users a psychedelic trip when they consume magic mushrooms. Yep, these little guys were tripping. What happened next was mind-boggling. The mice, who had been terrified of that beep noise, even when there was no longer any electric shock to go with it, they now seemed at peace. The mice didn't have little rodent therapists to help them overcome their fears. Rather, a round of psychedelic drugs had, as the research put it, extinguished their fears. The researchers didn't want to base their conclusions off mere observation. The mice didn't seem afraid, but they wanted more evidence to confirm the attitude shift. So it was that the researchers literally counted the mice's brain cells. Sound hard? It is. Not only had the mice overcome their fear of the beep thanks to the psilocybin, portions of their brain had grown. Remember how we talked about the amygdala growing in long-term cases of PTSD? Well, now we have more positive areas of the brain expanding in your emotional favor. Many studies now indicate that psilocybin and other psychedelic drugs enable neurogenesis in the human brain too. The brain can actually grow back. This is fantastic news for long-term sufferers of PTSD, whose brain cells may have experienced damage from prolonged anxiety and fear. Psychologists used to believe that the brain couldn't regenerate. But we are now seeing that psychedelics are like freshly fallen snow on a well-worn ski slope. It helps to cover the negative pathways and secure a fresh start. Psilocybin is non-addictive. Overdose is nearly impossible. It grows in nature and can be consumed unprocessed. And it has wildly successful rates of treating PTSD and other mental illnesses in just one dose. Still, it remains illegal in most states, which is incredibly sad and incredibly suspicious, if you ask me. Still, if this option sounds as promising to you as it sounds to me, here are some potential solutions to help you legally access medicinal psychedelics. Option A, ketamine. Ketamine is a psychedelic, very similar to magic mushrooms' psilocybin. It's legal with a prescription and is particularly effective when administered intravenously. A less potent and less expensive alternative to ketamine injections is a mail-order ketamine. You'll speak remotely with a specialist who can prescribe and send ketamine tablets. It is a psychedelic, meaning hallucinations are common, but many people report that these hallucinations help them work through their pains and traumas. Another option for accessing psychedelic therapy is to do it in a legal area. Psilocybin has been decriminalized in a handful of states and is completely legal in countries like Spain. For many, traveling for psilocybin is out of the question. However, there may be medical research in your area where professionals can legally administer psilocybin and other psychedelics for research purposes. Our last recommendation for accessing psychedelic therapy is legalize nature. The growing movement, Decriminalize Nature, speaks for itself. It advocates for the decriminalization of psychoactive plants and fungi. This may be the slowest route to getting you those magic mushrooms or whatever psychoactive medicinal substance you're looking for, but it's worth a mention. Psychedelic mushrooms, marijuana, and other psychoactive plants and fungi have incredible health benefits with much fewer side effects than traditional pharmaceuticals. If you'd like to influence the perspective around criminal plants, visit decriminalizenature.org. Every time you listen to our podcast, you're joining us in our mission to take back the world one brain at a time. When you listen and subscribe, it helps the almighty algorithms put our show in front of more people. Please pop that subscribe button so you never have to miss a show and we never have to miss a listener. Really. We like you. A lot. Method number 3 for trauma healing, the most controversial approach that you need to hear. For my last point, I'd like to begin with neuroscientist and professional therapist, Will Smith.
I was just having a debate with a friend of mine, and we got stuck on the difference between fault and responsibility. And she kept talking about how something was somebody's fault, it's somebody's fault. And I was like, it don't matter whose fault it is that something is broken if it's your responsibility to fix it. For example, it's not somebody's fault if their father was an abusive alcoholic. But it's for damn sure their responsibility to figure out how they're going to deal with those traumas and try to make a life out of it. It's not your fault if your partner cheated and ruined your marriage, but it is for damn sure your responsibility to figure out how to take that pain and how to overcome that and build a happy life for yourself. Fault and responsibility do not go together. It sucks, but they don't. When something is somebody's fault, we want them to suffer. We want them punished. We want them to pay. And we want it to be their responsibility to fix it. But that's not how it works, especially when it's your heart. Your heart, your life, your happiness is your responsibility and your responsibility alone. As long as we're pointing the finger and stuck in whose fault something is, we're jammed and trapped into victim mode. When you're in victim mode, you are stuck in suffering. The road to power is in taking responsibility. Your heart, your life, your happiness is your responsibility and your responsibility alone.
Obviously, Will Smith is not a neuroscientist, he's not a therapist, even though he's played some pretty good doctors in the movies. Anyway, that's beside the point. What the real point is somewhere along the line, whether it's today, next week, next year, you're going to have to take responsibility of that trauma of yours. If you've experienced trauma, chances are it's not your fault. During those traumatizing moments, your control over the situation was stolen from you. But I'm asking you to take it back as soon as you possibly can. Trauma is not an event. It's the emotional response to an event. And this is good news in disguise. Events we can't change, but responses, hell yes we can. I'm not saying you have much control over your first reaction when trauma comes. For example, we mentioned Jamie earlier in this episode. The little girl that went on to document her therapy sessions on National Public Radio. When she was assaulted, her reaction to freeze, her attempt to scream, it wasn't something she had that much control over. Her brain had been hijacked by a profound feeling of terror. In her case, that might have been the right thing to do. In your case, if you've ever experienced trauma, maybe you reacted in a way that you regret. But remember, unless you've been highly trained beforehand, that instinctual reaction to trauma, it's probably not under your control. What happens in the time to come, however, is. I'm talking about that wrestle you have to have with your amygdala, that fear-anxiety center in your brain. I'm talking about picking up your pieces and putting them back together again. Even if it's a human at fault for your trauma, they actually can't completely fix what they've done to you. It was their fault. But how you move forward is your responsibility. Of my 3 suggestions, this is possibly the most controversial, and I dearly hope it doesn't hurt anyone who is feeling vulnerable and fragile after a traumatic event. But I believe that without the concept of taking responsibility, the other approaches we covered aren't going to serve you nearly as well. I gave you a quote from a not actual scientist, Will Smith. Now, here's a stunning quote from a real psychiatrist, Dr. Anna Lembke. Dr. Lemke is not only a psychiatrist, but she is chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She's been around a lot of pain and mental illness and has written some groundbreaking books. And this is what she has to say about taking responsibility.
In the more than 20 years as a psychiatrist listening to tens of thousands of patient stories, I have become convinced that the way we tell our personal stories is a marker and predictor of mental health. Patients who tell stories in which they are frequently the victim, seldom bearing responsibility for bad outcomes, are often unwell and remain unwell. They are too busy blaming others to get down to the business of their own recovery. By contrast, when my patients start telling stories that accurately portray their responsibility, I know they're getting better. The victim narrative reflects a wider societal trend in which we're all prone to see ourselves as the victims of circumstance and deserving of compensation or reward for our suffering. Even when people have been victimized, if the narrative never moves beyond victimhood, it's difficult for healing to occur.
I can see how this quote may seem painful to people that have legitimately, unequivocally been the victim of a damaging situation. At first glance, it may seem to say, "Toughen up, Buttercup. Stop looking at your pain like it's pain and take some responsibility for what happened to you." But pain is pain. And as I've mentioned, you might bear no fault in what happened to you. However, I don't think Dr. Lemke is saying that the pain you feel is in some way your fault, or that you're just making it up. I believe she is saying that from her experience with thousands of patients, those that accept responsibility for their recovery have the best outlook, regardless of what caused their mental illness. Let me replay that last part of her quote.
Even when people have been victimized, if the narrative never moves beyond victimhood, it's difficult for healing to occur.
As you move forward with your own healing or assisting someone else's, remember, it takes time for brains to heal. It takes patience as we figure out what the heck we're doing. Often, healing decisions aren't natural. They're not instinctive. And you often only discover the right way to move forward after experimenting with many of the wrong ways to move forward. Trauma is a tough one, but you are tougher. Your brain is never done changing, and that's great news for those of us who could really use the change. We're nearing the end of today's toolbox, but first, we want to follow up on last week's Silver Liners Challenge. We asked you to try a little something called the physiological sigh for at least 5 minutes. So, did you do it? And if so, how well did it work for you? If you missed last week's episode or skipped the challenge for whatever reason, we invite you to revisit part 2 of our most recent episode and give the physiological sigh a shot. Or if you prefer, dive into any of today's 3 techniques to help you combat any trauma symptoms you may be experiencing. In a nutshell, those techniques include CPT therapy, which you can find for less than, say, $30 in a number of highly rated books, or pay a therapist to walk you through it. There's also psychedelic therapy, and that tough one at the end, taking responsibility. I'd also like to throw a shout out to the team at After School, who published Dr. Lemke's quote on victimhood versus responsibility. Thank you, After School, for the permission to publish that material. I also feel the need, just in case someone missed the joke, to point out that Will Smith is not a neuroscientist. Anyway, thanks again for listening, everyone. We really hope to see you again for our next episode to tackle a juicy mental health myth that we have in store for you. In the meantime, we're thrilled to give you one of our favorite parts of our show, the cheesy joke of the week. Why are Skittles so happy? They're never blue. Just a little reminder, if you got any value from today's episode, if you felt like your mind or heart was at all improved because of what you heard today, we would love it if you would follow the podcast and share it with the people in your life that might also need that little boost. Thank you and have a good week.